The PRovoke podcast, brought to you by PRovoke Media and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers.
Hello everyone, welcome to the PRovoke podcast. This is Arun Sudhaman. I'm joining the podcast from Hong Kong, where of course I'm working from home. And I think this is a really well-timed podcast for all of our listeners, all of whom I assume are also working at home, and all of whom are, of course, getting to grips with the global COVID-19 pandemic. We're very lucky to be joined on this podcast by three senior specialists from Ogilvy Asia-Pacific PR and Influence. And in no particular order, we have Scott Kronick, who's very well known as Chief Executive of PR and Influence at Ogilvy Asia-Pacific. We have Michelle Ng, who's Executive Director at Ogilvy Singapore. And we have Simon Webb, who is Senior VP at Ogilvy Beijing. Welcome to all three of you. Thanks for joining the podcast today.
Thank you, Arun. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Scott, first of all, how are you viewing this current crisis? Because, of course, you've been in Beijing, I assume, since it all started. So you have a pretty good vantage point.
So I've been living with this for quite a while. I'm actually not in Beijing at the moment, Arun. I left right before the Chinese New Year, and because I had to do some travel, I didn't go back. And then now there's, quarantine issues on both sides wherever you travel. So I'm trying to figure that out. But my wife is there, and all my staff are there, and we've been managing on a day-to-day basis. So we've been living this for a while. And I'm calling from the U.S. at the moment, where just moments ago in California, the governor has kind of required everybody to stay at home. So it's interesting to see it come full circle here. So it's this is when we think about COVID-19 in the area of crisis management, it's a different animal than most crises we've been dealing with for my time in Asia. I mean, we've been through this once before with SARS, and so we had some learning from there. But it's a different type of a crisis, actually. It's not like any one particular person or company has done something that you point the fingers at. And so everybody's a bit of a victim here. And what really matters, at least in my experience, has been what matters is how companies respond to it.
Yeah.
How are they responding? Are they timely? Are they transparent? Are they looking after the people that really matter to them most, which are employees? So a lot of companies we've seen, who've said employees are their most important kind of asset, they're really being put into the test in terms of, do they really deliver on what they mean? So that's been interesting.
Sure. So Michelle, you're based in Singapore, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Right. And Simon, you're in Australia right now.
Yes, normally based in Beijing, but a COVID-19 refugee at the moment in Australia.
Yeah. So Michelle, how's the situation from where you're sitting? Because I think for many in the world, they see Singapore as almost a model for how to address it at least from a governmental perspective.
We had our first case, a confirmed case of COVID-19 in Singapore on January 23rd. The government, which has had a lot of experience dealing with SARS back in 2003, responded very swiftly. Excuse me. And so there were measures put in place immediately to advise companies and individuals as to what they needed to do. And when we saw initially a first escalation in the number of cases, but a couple of weeks later, after the government went into what we call DORSCON Orange or Code Orange, we saw the situation managed in a much more holistic way. Companies were given advisories on what to do with employees in travel, and there were lots of calls for people to really take care of their own health and how to do so. So the government has been very much on the forefront of containment, and a lot of companies have followed these advisories. And we saw then a dip, and we were having quite a number of days of single-digit confirmed cases. But then over in the past week or so, we've seen again an escalation in the number of cases to double-digit cases confirmed every day for the past couple of days. And these have been from imported cases primarily. So people who are returning from their trips overseas or work trips overseas, a number of them are infected. And so now we're in a situation where, we're again in heightened alert status. And this has also really impacted how companies respond. So many of the companies have, gotten people to work from home in order to flatten the curve, and basically reducing the risk by them traveling to and from work and being all together in the same space. So many of us are working from home. And we're also looking at different ways in which we're responding, in terms of meeting partners, meeting clients, etc. So the response has been very much guided by what the government initiatives have been, but I think a lot of companies here are, also having lived through SARS, very much more prompt in their response.
It sounds very much like the situation in Hong Kong. I mean, I think a week ago, we felt here it was under control. So the daily rate was not growing, but exactly as you've described, there's been a big surge in the last few days, and all from people returning. So this is obviously it's a global crisis, and in many ways it's an unprecedented crisis. Now, all of you are very experienced in terms of helping corporates, helping companies plan for these types of situations. But amid this coronavirus, I mean, do you feel that corporate crisis plans are actually fit for purpose given the responses you've seen from companies?
So maybe I can address that first, Arun. In some crazy way, the one fortunate consequence in all of what's transpired, if there's any fortunate consequence, is that communications is taken front and center to that of marketing. It's less important to sell now. It's more important to keep everybody informed of what's going on. And I just feel like it's given a heightened importance to what all of us do as a profession. And we always have a point of view on the role of communications, but in this particular circumstance, companies have had to communicate a lot more often and a lot more frequently, actually, than they've had to in the past. And so I think it's given a heightened importance to what we do. The old crisis plans were trying to be open, transparent about what's transpired from whatever crisis or issue that took place and what the company was doing about it. This issue is not necessarily pointing a finger at anybody in particular, because everybody seems to be a victim. So it's more about what are you doing about the constituencies that are most important to you, and how you're communicating with them? So it's a bit of a different dynamic. Some of the same fundamentals are there, but it's a crisis of a different nature. Simon, did you want to comment on what you're seeing there?
Yeah, one thing I was probably going to add is, to your point, Arun and Scott, about crisis plans. We often see, and we have a tendency, there's that thing that people say about generals are always fighting the last war, and crisis plans can often be built around the types of incidents that organizations have been through in the past and therefore feel most likely to them to happen again. Whereas what we try and do when we start to build our clients' capability to deal with crises, to become more resilient, is to try and change that mindset from focusing on the crises that they can most easily bring to mind, so getting past the availability bias, and really moving towards a frame of mind which is about having the tools to be nimble, to move quickly, to assemble the right groups of people together to respond. And so it's a skill set. So we often talk about, to our clients, we often talk about that our job is to help them build muscle memory, so that in the moment where they're actually dealing with something, they're not having to think about who should I involve or what's the process here. It's that they've built all of this, they've run through all of these tools, the practices, the processes, so that they're ready to act and to move ahead. And it's not, so we don't encourage them to necessarily focus exclusively on a specific list of types of crisis that they might be facing. It's much more about a mindset and the skills to be able to move when they need to. And that we find is really important.
How much is this particular crisis, given that it does seem to be something that is so unforeseen, how much is that testing these kinds of skills and mindsets?
Hugely. I mean, this is not, depending on the organization. I mean, if you're an airline, for example, you absolutely feel today like you're looking down the barrel of possibly the end of your existence. I mean, we've already seen a number of small carriers going bust, and the bigger players, for example, must be feeling incredibly vulnerable. That said, if you're a supermarket, on the other hand, or you're in a number of other sectors, you feel incredibly vital and central, and your problem is not so much the lack of capacity, but actually managing restrictions, trying to do your best to make sure that you're dealing with customers in an equitable fashion, and that you keep the shelves stocked as much as you can. I think the challenge is very, very much across sectors, but I'm pretty certain that there'd be very few people running these organizations now that could point to something in their recent history that has challenged them in this way. I mean, this I think is entirely unprecedented. So it's just about not drawing on anything you probably got in your bottom drawer in terms of a scenario plan, as much as making sure that you bring the right people within your organization together, take a flexible approach to how it is that you're going to deliver your product or service, and keep your employees top of mind, your customers very clearly as a focus as well, and also make sure that you manage all of your relationships with people like the government, NGOs. There are lots of moving parts here. And I'm sure organizations are, as I say, being stressed in ways they've never felt they had to.
I think the one difficulty here is that they usually in crisis management, they say sometimes you can't control what happens to you, but you can control what you do about it. And I think, I haven't seen a ton of blunders. We've seen some, a few missteps here and there, but not a lot of blunders. People are I've been collecting every single service provider's letter that they've written related to this, and they all kind of they all are care and concern, and they set the right tone. I think the big challenge is in this particular case, it's hard to see. No one wants to commit to when we're going to come out of this. And what life is going to be like in a month or 2 months or 3 months down the line. I mean, everybody's hopeful, as am I, that soon as summer comes, this is going to dissipate because of whatever science there is that it can't exist in the heat or whatever you've heard around those types of areas. But it's hard to build plans without an end in sight, basically.
So there are no good answers right now, I guess, in terms of corporate communications, which is difficult. The other thing, Simon, you mentioned, which I think is really interesting, is the human impact is really strong. I mean, that's somewhat uncommon compared to many crises. The fact that employees are maybe the primary stakeholder group in this case. They're working from home. They're having to consider the impact on friends and family, particularly older relatives. I just wonder how, from your perspective, what kind of advice you give to corporates in that kind of situation, given that I would imagine a lot of crisis planning is quite external focused.
It's a good point. I'll talk a little bit on this, but I know Michelle will have a lot of a really valuable contribution here, because she deals a lot with how companies deal internally quite a bit. But my feeling is it starts with making sure that you can continue to provide your product or service in a way that is safe to your employees. So can you continue operating and remain and do it in a way that's safe? Once you get past that, you then start to think about, I think also, frankly, modifying your expectations about how work gets done, what professionalism looks like in the workplace. Now, every now and again, I have a 3-year-old who decides to crash one of my video conferences. And perhaps a few months back, I might have felt a bit embarrassed if that happened when it was an important client call. Now, those are the breaks, and I've reset my expectations. I've told my team the same, and I'm sure the clients I'm dealing with understand too. So I think everybody understands that these are quite different times, and that you have to find different ways of working and managing. Also, using technology in particular, I think, as a way of staying connected even when your workforce is dissipated is really important. Our teams in Beijing use Zoom and WeChat video chats quite a lot to make sure that we continue to get face-to-face access even when we're not able to be physically in the same space. And that's really important, because the connection, you get cabin fever, literally, stuck at home, and your ability to be productive seems to fall on certain types of work anyway, when you're not able to be face-to-face with people. So I think those sorts of things become very important. There's a big focus on employee well-being in ways that you never took it for granted before, but it was easier to achieve, I suppose. But Michelle, you probably have something you can build on there.
I think the main point is that in such times we over communicate rather than under communicate with employees, and this starts really from the BCP, or the business continuity plan, that an organization has. It needs to have a task force built around it in order to lift, the important bits of the BCP. Look at how the government is advising what companies should do. Creating, again, your own set of how you are actually going to respond to every time the needle moves on this situation, and really communicating that to employees. I think that, we've heard in the very early days, a lot of conversations going on about hey, what's your company doing? And our company's not doing that. And oh dear, are we, behind the curve, right? And so it's really important for organizations to over communicate during this time, so that employees really know what they need to do whenever an initiative is launched. I agree with you, Simon. I'm feeling the cabin fever very, very much. And we had a conversation within our BCP team just yesterday, and it was very much around cabin fever and looking at how we can actually help alleviate some of that. I've told my team, for example, let's have lunch over Zoom and let's have a look at each other and see how we're doing, because we're very social by nature. And so being, just holed up at home, it's quite difficult. So that's an area I think that, organizations also need to look into. It's not just about providing them with the tools and ways of working, but also this aspect, in order to help us all maintain our sanity somewhat. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what do you think the lessons will be for companies? I don't know if it's too early to say, but as we look ahead, what kind of crisis lessons do you think they will derive from this current situation that perhaps weren't as apparent before?
I would argue there are really three lessons, and I don't think that they're different from before. So it's really communicate fast and early.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's if anybody, if China's getting criticized for anything, it's just communicating quickly and early. Second would be to be open and transparent.
Mm.
And then the third would be you don't have to have all the answers, but you need to be seen as doing the right thing.
Right.
I would put down those as three lessons, and that's not different from others,
Mm-hmm.
but it seems to be a more acute with COVID-19.
Mm.
Michelle, Simon, do you have anything you want to add to that?
The only thing I think I would add is a little bit, maybe reiterating the point I made before, which is don't just think you can prepare, you are prepared if you've prepared for all of the scenarios you can imagine, right? This was well beyond the imagination, I think, of quite a lot of organizations until quite recently. This just wasn't something that we were ready for. So it's about building in the flexibility, the resilience, the ability to move at speed within your organization as much as it is about having a specific, very detailed enumerated list of different scenarios and your mitigation measures. It's much more about frame of mind than it is about a very strict list of things that you know how to deal with.
Michelle?
No, I agree with Scott and Simon. I think the lessons that organizations will take away from this is, firstly, they've got to refresh their BCP, because I think a lot of the BCP terms were, probably SARS, in terms of pandemics, it was really looking at it from a SARS perspective, and now they've got to refresh it to a COVID-19 perspective, and also to ensure that they have the teams in place. Everyone's got a role in order to navigate through the crisis. So organizations need to be prepared to that extent. But like Simon says, you're never prepared enough, because you don't know where the situation will change and to what extent. So there needs to be some flexibility as well in terms of the response. But completely agree with Scott. It's all about transparency and being early, and your information to all of your stakeholders.
And perhaps the last thing here is you need to get used to this. This is the second time for me in the last 3 months that we sort of been kicked out of where we were planning to be. We were, the bushfires in Australia around Christmas evicted us from where we were supposed to be, and now this has taken us away from home as well. This is a world that it strikes me as becoming more uncertain, more disrupted, and potentially the opportunities for fairly serious crises to emerge, be they environmental, health-related, political, social, economic, are heightened. I think we've had realistically a very comfortable 30, 40 years, and now things are going to be a little bit more challenging for us. So we just all need to get used to this as well.
And just, do any of you find that you're having to tell your clients to actually be more visible and resist the temptation to go silent?
Yeah, I have a specific example. I can't tell you the name of the client, but I'm working with a client who's in an industry that's very disrupted, and they're concerned that if they don't know for certain what they're going to be able to offer their customers in the coming weeks and months, they don't want to say anything at all in case what they do say ends up being wrong. And so they've sort of resorted to fairly bland brand marketing because they know it's safe, and they feel they can't get that wrong. My feeling is that, and our advice to them has been that you need to be both more relevant to what your customers are going through at the moment. So you need to speak to the disruption that quarantine is causing, the uncertainty that exists in their life, and you can also be a bit more honest and transparent and say, look, these are the things that we hope to be able to deliver and offer to you in the coming months, but there are no guarantees today. And I think the third thing that we suggesting that they might do is to use the platform that they had through their social channels to actually address some of the damage that the COVID-19 is creating. That's not just spreading good health information so that people do flatten the curve, practice good social distancing, good hygiene, and so on. But it's also addressing some of the paranoia and the xenophobia that has sprung up alongside this. And we're certainly seeing a lot of fairly unpleasant anti-China sentiment out there, and brands can help address that as well.
Scott?
Yeah, no, I concur with Simon. I kind of think there's a balance. So, I equate this to being on a plane that's delayed, and the captain comes on the plane and announces every 2-3 minutes what's going on, and at some point it just exasperates you because you're not getting any good news. So I do think that there's like a balance between, you have to communicate often. You have to show some positivity and some direction, or at least some transparency on what's happening, but you're doing the best you can do in given these circumstances, and this is what's going to transpire. But it's definitely putting lots of people into challenges. Think about, I'll give you another example. Schools and tuition payments. And I just, obviously paid tuition for my son in college. And I was on an email with a parent who's also questioning whether he should pay the final semester. And I'm like, well, they're going to do online courses, and, it's tragic. They may not have a graduation, but this is a new reality. And I think sometimes you need to be a bit, as a consumer of these things, you need to be a bit understanding that not every organization is perfect in the way they do these, and they're figuring it out. But those organizations need to be communicative and thoughtful, and probably not overdo it.
Sure. Michelle, any thoughts?
So we've had some conversations with clients about how to look at the months ahead of us, right? And right now we are in, again, as mentioned, a heightened state where we're seeing a number of import cases. But the question is, have we hit rock bottom yet? And what is the point that will tell us that we are in recovery? So we're looking at the different scenarios in those three areas. So one is status quo, then as we move towards an even worse situation, and then recovery. And we're asking them, what's the story you want to tell throughout this period? And what are the mini stories you want to tell as we are in these different periods? And it's really important for them not to disappear, and to also ensure that they are, that they remain top of mind. So what's the story you can tell so that when we are looking at recovery, you are bouncing back and not just, walking or crawling back. So, so some of these conversations are now taking place, and we're helping them to plan around that.
I think Michelle's point is really, really important, because we know we need to be focused on how brands are going to recover now, even if we don't know whether that recovery is 3 months from now, 6 months, 9 months, whatever. And one of the core messages that I think pretty much every brand is going to want to try and deliver is, we were there for you then, we're still here for you now, come back, right? And the brands that decide to clam up, the brands that focus perhaps more on themselves and less on what their customers were going through during this time, are going to have a pretty hard time of explaining when it's all over, that they weren't just fair weather friends, right? They weren't just there when it suited them, and then went into a ball when times got tough. I really think that it's very important for brands now to be doing, not, as Scott said, right up the front. This isn't about marketing anymore. This is much more about doing your part, seeing how it is that you can help address these issues, and be relevant to your customers and your clients when they're going through these tough times.
Yeah.
But just not hiding.
Hey, Arun, there are two things that both Simon and Michelle said, and that's plan for the recovery. And the exciting thing, I'll tell you, I've had a couple of conference calls this week. I have some next week on what are we going to do once we come out of this? How do we go big? Actually, there's a lot of discussion about brands now, about what do we do to show our commitment to, reestablish ourselves once we come out of this. So I think organizations need to be doing that now. The other thing that Michelle said was, what's the narrative? What's the story you want to tell? We have one client that has begun a massive internal campaign focusing on the internal heroes that make up this company. This is a company that has a very strong culture, and people are very proud to have worked there, and they're capturing all those internal stories so they can, that can be part of the whole narrative that they're going to have coming out of this. But I think if you think through and visualize those stories coming out of this, it's a really good exercise to do with your team in preparation for when we do come out of this.
Do you think in general companies think seriously enough about the recovery phase of crisis management?
Not enough. I mean, as an organization, we've been working on this, what we call it brand shield, And we've been operating this crisis product for many, many years, and we've just refreshed it, and with lots of data input, and it's got 4 steps. It's all about readiness,
Sure.
risk mapping, response, and recovery. And the most robust area that we collected our experience across those 4 areas, and we have lots of experience in the first 3 and less so in the last. So there needs to be a lot more done. I will tell you that historically we've been called on response to respond and help them manage this. And since we've developed this toolkit, we've gotten more engagements. And in fact, our first kind of quarter this year is looking not so bad, because we've got a number of these risk preparatory cases going on, whereby companies have said, we want to be better prepared to handle crises and issues across the globe. And there's one particular bit that I think is that we've been asked for on several occasions that's really, I think, part of the whole modern marketing mix. But it's something Simon's been doing on kind of influencer assessment. Simon, you want to tell Arun what you're doing in that case? Because I think it's indicative of assignments that we're going to be doing a greater amount of in the future.
Yeah, of course. And look, I think you're right that one of the things that we see brands increasingly realizing is that the company they keep, in terms of the influencers and others that they partner with, is hugely important and reflects back on the brand now in ways that historically it maybe didn't do quite as much of. And also with a sort of more active, woke consumer base, you've got more people who are prepared to make a lot of noise and expect brands to respond. So one of the things that we increasingly are asked to do is to help brands understand the risks involved in engaging with a particular influencer or set of influencers. And we'll go through and identify the areas that brands need to be accountable to their customers on in relation to that, in relation to the market they're in, the customer expectations and so on. And these are increasingly onerous. I mean, and their expectations are very high on how brands will behave and should behave. And you've got to add in also the complication of working across different markets where a person may be particularly popular and well loved in, say, mainland China, but not so much loved in perhaps Hong Kong or in Taiwan. And this is increasingly common. And how does a brand navigate that? What are any number of risks associated with types of behaviors that are legal or socially acceptable in some markets, but not so much in others? And we've been doing this a lot, particularly for a large global cosmetics company, one of the biggest in the world. We spent a lot of time the last 18 months getting all of the key serious partners that they're engaging with. And you'd be amazed at the types of problems you uncover, and that hadn't necessarily been expected or anticipated. I mean, drug use, people, blackface, social attitudes, religious beliefs, attitudes towards weapons, guns, all sorts of things. It's incredibly powerful.
You're right. I mean, the whole threat environment, like as you mentioned, does seem to have expanded in recent years. Do you think that's fair, or do you think maybe there's more molehills than there are mountains these days?
I don't know about molehills and mountains. I suspect there are quite a few mountains still. I think it's as much also that people are using influencers and key opinion leaders and so on as actual media channels now, and they become very reliant on these people, and that so because brands are using them more, then their reputations become much more relevant and much more of a threat to organizations than they were in the past. So I think it's partly driven by that dependence. It's sort of a switch in the marketing mix.
All right. Part of what makes them a great influencer in one market could totally upset a consumer base in another market. And so this tool that Simon's been using is to filter and to put a advisory on, we understand the influencers, what makes an influencer is they have a point of view. But if this point of view makes its way into this market, for example, it could create some problems. And we're just trying to serve as a advisory firm in that respect, so that to guide the company. They haven't changed all of their influencer relationships, but they definitely enter them in a much more careful way. It's looked at the contracting, what they're allowed to do, things of that nature.
Well, I feel like we could keep talking about this for quite a lot more, because this COVID-19 crisis, as we've discussed, there are a number of layers to it, a number of lessons, but I'm mindful of I assume all of you have very busy days as we try and navigate our way out of this crisis. So thank you all very much for your time. I'm hopeful that the conversation on this podcast has proven useful to our listeners. I've certainly found it very insightful. I mean, a number of things that jumped out to me. Scott, you mentioned that it's really about communications over marketing. Simon, you talked about the importance of mindset. Michelle, you mentioned that now is the time to over communicate. And then I think some of the other points that I think were really well received around employee well-being, about the importance of multiple stakeholder groups, and of course, just the human cost in terms of employee well-being. So, as we all know, it's a very fluid situation. I wish you all, the best of luck. Stay safe, stay healthy, for you, for everyone you're connected with, and of course your clients as well. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Arun. We really enjoyed this. Yes, thanks so much.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll be back with another podcast soon.
You've been listening to the PRovoke podcast, brought to you by PRovoke Media and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers.